Hello and welcome to Urban Consulate. I am Naima Bilal, your host for this evening. I'm joining you from Cincinnati, Ohio. And I am welcoming each of you tonight to what might be the most emotionally freighted and historically weighted discussion that we have had in 2020. And we've had many weighted and freighted discussions. We are joined tonight to talk about one key topic, and that is the election and the city. This conversation is meant to help us process some things together about where we go, specifically through the lens of the outcome of the election and the impacts on neighborhoods, cities, and our nation. I speak for myself when I say I'm coming to this discussion with a mixed bag of emotions this evening. I feel, of course, a sense of relief. I can't so much feel as if I am in a mood to celebrate, although I won't deny that the Democrats and Joe Biden and Kamala Harris, the first Black and Asian woman to secure the vice presidency, represents a win. But I also feel as if we have reached the summit of Mount Kilimanjaro, only to have magically appear before us a completely new structure that we have to scale once again, except we're exhausted. We are starved for air at the top of that mountain. And here we are together, rolling up our sleeves once again, because if this election cycle has taught us anything, it is that if we had done anything less, the outcome would have been very different. Furthermore, now is the time to stay engaged, and it certainly isn't the time to disengage. So with that, I am so excited to be joined by three extraordinary guests who will be offering their own personal perspectives to this conversation. At the end of our dialogue today, as is typical for us, we will turn the questions over to you that you can then ask our guests. And so we'll ask you to, of course, interact in the chat. We want to hear your thoughts. We'd like to hear your perspectives because they add to the discourse, right? And just keep those questions filtered throughout the evening, and we'll make sure that we send them over to our guests. So first, I am very pleased to welcome Oscar Perry Abbayo, joining us from New York. Hi, Oscar. Oscar is a senior economics correspondent for Next City, a nonprofit online magazine that amplifies solutions for greater economic, environmental, and social justice in cities. Oscar previously served as the Next City's editor-in-chief served as Next City's editor from 2018 to 2019, and was a Next City Equitable Cities Fellow from 2015 to 2016. Since 2011, Oscar has covered community development finance, community banking, impact investing, economic development, housing, and more for media outlets such as Shelterforce, B Magazine, Impact Alpha, and Fast Company. Welcome, Oscar.
Thanks, Naima. Thanks, everyone, for welcoming me to your space.
Great. We are next joined by Catherine Gardet. Catherine Gardet is a living legend in Cincinnati. She is a treasure and a gem in our city, and we're so honored to have her with us this evening. Catherine Gardet is the president of the Walnut Hills Area Council, with family roots that go back 5 generations. So this is a native Cincinnatian. Walnut Hills, just for some context, is one of the oldest neighborhoods in Cincinnati, and it's known for its cultural, ethnic, religious, and socioeconomic diversity. In 2015, when she was named Woman of the Year by the Cincinnati Enquirer, that's our local news publication, she was described as one of Walnut Hill's most tenacious, active, and collaborative neighbors. A wonderful combination to have. She was also described as a mover who gets things done, and I hope you get a bit of a view into that energy and passion this evening. Catherine is also an artist and a musician whose influence has been felt across organizations around Cincinnati. In 1996, Catherine helped develop Artworks, which today is an extraordinary arts organization with major impact in our city. And you can visually see its impact in hundreds of murals that scale 40, 50, 60 feet high all around the city. Catherine was a founding member of the Cincinnati Arts Association Diversity Committee. Catherine has also served many other organizations, including Learning Through Art and the Ohio Arts Council. Welcome, Catherine. It is so great to share digital space with you today.
It is my pleasure to be here this evening.
I am also so happy to be joined by Elizabeth Hopkins. Elizabeth Hopkins is also joining us from Cincinnati, and Elizabeth is also a native Cincinnatian. Elizabeth is a state organizing director for the American Civil Liberties Union of Ohio. Elizabeth has spent most of her career building power for everyday people. So we're talking grassroots organizing, including fighting for criminal justice reform and reproductive freedom. Before joining the ACLU, she worked with the Amos Project in Cincinnati, a faith-based justice movement of the Ohio Organizing Collaborative, Cincinnati's Economics of Compassion Initiative, and Planned Parenthood of Southwest Ohio. She was a statewide leader in the Issue 1 drug sentencing reform campaign of 2018. At the ACLU, she leads the organizing team and thousands of justice-minded volunteers across Ohio to preserve civil liberties for every new generation. Elizabeth, welcome to Urban Consulate Cincinnati.
Hey, like you just blew me up. Thank you.
You know, sometimes you just need that, especially during these days, right? We need some uplift.
Absolutely. Well, thank you all for having me. And I'm so grateful that I'm here, and I'm super pleased to be on stage with you all. I love you, Catherine. I've been following you for a while, so I see you and I appreciate you. So thank you.
Well, let's do a little check-in with each other, because a big thing happened on Saturday when Joe Biden, it's official, Joe Biden and Kamala Harris have won the White House. It means a lot for a lot of different people. So I'd like to check in with each of you. I'm going to start with you, Elizabeth. What kinds of thoughts, emotions, feelings are you bringing to the center of this conversation today?
Thank you for that. You know, this last week and a half has been a really long century, and I feel exhausted. I feel the weight of that 100 years of 7 days weighing on my shoulders. I have mixed emotions. I think one emotion that I feel right now is joy. I'm deeply excited that 75 million people chose Joe Biden, chose Kamala to represent our country. And I also feel sorrow. And it's not like, to me, Trump is an idea. Trump is a shield for an idea. He's an ideology. And I wonder how we as a society, how we get back to a place of unity without sacrificing ourselves, our freedom, our morals, our values. I think that folks on either side of the aisle have morals and values. And I think that one of the things that I would love to see is bridge building, but not at the risk of losing accountability and truth. So I'm coming into this space with a lot on my mind, with a heavy heart, and with a fresh resolve to have thousands of conversations in Ohio that really focus on what are the shared values and how do we create a new identity, a new American identity that's rooted in those shared values. I'm also tired, y'all. I've been homeschooling. I'm tired. So
We're going to get to that a little bit later because you shared something with us earlier about you homeschooling 2 children, and I let you know that that makes your presence here today and your work organizing that much more important. And we're very grateful for you. Oscar, what thoughts and emotions are you centering?
Well, first of all, let me thank you, everyone really who has been doing this with children at home, with that logistical and emotional burden that I don't share. So I don't have kids at home. I'm just here with my 2 cats and my partner in New York City. And I have a different kind of emotional burden as a journalist. We have to suppress emotions a lot of the time, because we have to observe, take notes, contextualize, research, file stories every now and then, at least. I have two deadlines a week that I have to file, and the feeling. I've also had mixed feelings for the past week, and especially since Friday or since Saturday morning, and it starts with just having to again really keep my own emotions in check while I go out and see like who is celebrating this. So the first thing I went out to see was just around the neighborhood a little bit. I live in Washington Heights. It's an uptown part of Manhattan. But then I had to go where you go in Manhattan if you want to know what this victory means. I went to 125th Street in Harlem, and I walked down from I live on the west side. I walked over to the east side at 7th Avenue, Adam Clayton Boulevard. Someone had gotten up on the statue and started playing the Black National Anthem. Lift every voice and sing. In the middle of not a huge crowd, but a few dozen, maybe 100, 150 people. And they broke out into a dance party. And then I went downtown to see other parts of Manhattan. And for my own safety and traveling on subways and crowds, I just stayed on Manhattan for the day. But it's part of my own research as a journalist. Who is out there celebrating this and feeling the emotions that they weren't sure they were going to feel until Saturday morning. It was around 11:30 in the morning, and I'm also feeling very curious now to see what will happen with the Senate, and what will happen with presidential appointments. With the transition coming up. What are some of the voices that are going to start to be floated? What are some of the voices that are going to be ignored or left behind? Because these are the things that I have to start reporting on and researching in order to provide the context of why does it matter who is the next controller of the currency? Why does it matter who is the next HUD secretary or Treasury secretary? Not just matter in the political sense of who won, but why does it matter to Walnut Hills or Harlem or Bed-Stuy or Jamaica or the north side of St. Louis or the south or west sides of Chicago or Oakland or New Orleans or the Third Ward in Houston? I need to start connecting those dots and that's a very different emotional journey for me under a Biden-Harris administration versus another 4 years of Trump. And I can't say, journalists, we have to be very careful with our words, so I can't quite put a word on it yet, but I can tell you for sure it feels very different from what it would be under a Trump administration, looking forward from where I'm sitting today.
It's so interesting you should say that. We'll get into it later, Oscar. I feel like in the wake of the Trump era, reporting the truth as a journalist is a revolutionary act. And so there's a lot of freightedness into that. It's sad to say, but here we are. Catherine, what emotions and thoughts are you bringing to the space tonight?
Hope and collaboration, and a sense of knowing that we are all connected, regardless of who we voted for or that we chose not to vote. That regardless of that, we all living in these here United States, this world, this planet, we are all connected. And so the more that we are cognizant and conscious to work for that collaboration and the connectedness, the better off we are. So I, like you, Elizabeth, I'm toying in both of that. And like you say, Oscar, as the president of the Walnut Hills Area Council, really wanting to be not showing favoritism either way, because I know the importance of the divergent attitudes, the divergent thought processes that really make a neighborhood whole. It takes all of that to be there. For me on Saturday, it was the last weekend of that Hank Willis Thomas exhibit. So I happened to go in early to the museum. And while I was in the exhibit, it was called. So imagine being in an exhibit that is talking about how people of color have been used inequitably in art, how being branded has made an impact in this country, how there's a piece where he has an absolute vodka, but inside of that vodka bottle is the slave ship, that it's sitting inside of that, so that we talk about the capitalism that Oscar has been looking for. So what I bring is that we must have conversations, not just every time there is an election and the lead up to that election, but we must continuously have conversations of what it means to be civically engaged. Whether you are 5 years old or 95 years old, there is still a place for being engaged in the civic conversation, and all of those perspectives are needed.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Catherine, for opening us up with a series of abounding hope. That's what we need going into this dialogue, because we're about to roll up our sleeves. We have some work to do. Let's talk about it. Elizabeth, let's dig into something important. You mentioned this, and can you kind of walk us through the narrative of what happened on the ground here in Cincinnati during this election cycle, and kind of outline for us like what the impacts were, the top line impacts on Cincinnatians?
Sure. I won't pretend to know everything that happened on the ground in Cincinnati, but what I do know is that organizers for Carrie Bloom worked their behinds off. Organizers for Kate Schroeder worked their behinds off. Organizers for Fanon Rucker worked their behinds off. There was a multitude of organizers, community activists, progressive movement folks, conservative movement folks who really did focus on Cincinnati, knowing that we had an opportunity to flip several seats that have been key inside of what happens with our folks, whether it's in the criminal justice reform system, whether it's in Congress with Shabbat, whether it is on a local level with our county commissioner's office, We've got folks like Alicia Reese, who has represented our community for a very long time, now as a county commissioner, which is super exciting. I think Alicia Reese would be one of the folks that we can make sure when we talk about our budget and we talk about the county budget, that we can make sure that our needs are represented with the county. I'm thinking about Joe Dieters a lot recently, partially because after Sam DuBose was murdered in Cincinnati, Joe Dieters was a really big focal point around the Ray Tenzing trial. And some of my first organizing experiences were trying to make sure that we felt like justice was served in the Black community with Sam DuBose and with Ray Tenzing. Dieters has been in office on and off since '82, which I just found that out recently. I think a lot about how prosecutors really hold the strings of power inside of our criminal justice reform system. And I think about how Fanon Rucker, although he did not win, ran a really good race against Dieters and maybe came closer than most could have at unseating Dieters from the county prosecutor. One of the things that I saw on the ground is the ability for our communities and for our organizers to be agile and to be flexible. None of us have ever organized in a pandemic. None of us have ever had to go fully digital with our organizing. I've spent more time on Zoom calls than I care to admit, with my door closed, more than I care to admit. But I think what we saw in Cincinnati and what we'll continue to see in Cincinnati is organizations reaching out to each other. We had some really strong collaboration and coalitions that were built to make sure that we're protecting the progress that we've made and expanding that even more. I think about the Amos Project still in Cincinnati that's being led by Paul Graham right now, and the three organizers there like Pastor Daniel Hughes, who's doing phenomenal work in the faith community. I think about one of my own organizers, Greer Ashbury with the ACLU, and how Amos and the ACLU and other organizations are coming together to look at criminal justice reform. I always want to shout out Iris Rowley, Mama Iris Rowley, who was so gently and fiercely shepherded the Black community and shepherded Cincinnati, right? As we think about what it looks like to organize, to have a groundswell of people who are connected, who are vibrant, and who are clear about what the goal is. And the goal is protecting our communities. And the goal is making sure that those that we elect serve us and they serve us well. And we can all follow Iris's leadership on that. Folks like Pastor Damon Lynch III over at New Prospect and the work that he does. So really, when I'm thinking about Cincinnati and what we did this past election cycle to make sure that we've got judges who represent our interest, to make sure our county commissioner represents our interest, I'm proud of us. I'm proud of us.
That's a good takeaway. That's the kind of optimism that I love to hear in a cycle that, you know, they weren't all wins, right? But we can take away some optimism. Oscar, your work in your writing lies at the heart of that intersection between national and local politics. What's top of mind for you today?
Today, what's top of mind for me when it comes to the intersection of national local politics is the Senate, first of all, and the organizing that went into, you know, local grassroots organizing around Atlanta and all over Georgia to get to this point where the Senate is so close to flipping. Those are, especially for me, you know, where it's next. I write for Next City. We write about cities, and so we have to lift up and recognize that cities are what they had the last say in this election. Whether it was Atlanta or Philadelphia or Detroit and Milwaukee, like where were all of our eyes turned for the past week? You know, except for the vote counts in those places. Even in Nevada, where were we looking? We were looking at Las Vegas. In Arizona, I mean, we were looking at Phoenix, but you know, Arizona is that great example of how the rural areas in Arizona, you know, do have a lot in common with folks in cities. You know, the folks out in Navajo Nation showed up and helped swing Arizona blue. And guess what? They have a lot in common. You know, they face a lot of the same structural injustice that folks in cities face. Surprise. So anyway, to come back to your question. So I have to live and recognize that cities and local politics and national politics intersect first at the voting box, at the ballot box, right? Like when the voters in cities show up, you have dramatically different outcomes. And right now, it's a very partisan outcome. I mean, you can look at the map and you can see even in a state like Ohio that went red, if you look at the counties, you can see where the counties are. You can see where Cincinnati is, Hamilton County. You can see where Cleveland is. Is that Cumberland County? I think it's Cleveland. You can see Columbus. You can see where Columbus is. People don't realize, at Next City, we know this. Columbus is a big city. It's 800,000 people. It's not a small city. So, so those votes have to matter. And that's where the intersection begins. And then, my specific job at Next City is to kind of start to show and make the connection between, all right, if we have a Biden-Harris administration, who becomes the next Treasury Secretary, and how does that determine what happens with the CARES Act dollars that are just sitting there? There's billions, hundreds of billions of dollars are sitting on the table doing nothing. They have congressional authorization to do something, and they are right now doing nothing because of who is Treasury Secretary and President, right? So that matters. The HUD Secretary, there's all kinds of issues with public housing in every city in the country. There's all kinds of issues with fair housing and the enforcement of those laws that the HUD Secretary has a lot to do with enforcing, right? And there's all kinds of intersections later. Oh, here's another one. Who's going to be the next labor secretary? Because under the Obama administration, from I want to say it was 2010 to 2016, the federal government collected $730,000 a day in stolen wages, right? $266 million a year in stolen wages. Yeah, that's not happening right now. It's just not, it has the power to do it, but it's not happening because of who's labor secretary and who's president. Those are actual dollars sitting in a government bank account right now that has people's names next to it on a line item. It says like, hey, these are your wages, farm worker, restaurant worker. This is money that you earned. It's sitting in this bank account ready for you to claim. You can go to you can go to the Department of Labor's website right now and type your name into a search engine to see if you have wage money owed to you right now. Hasn't been, from like 3 or 4 years ago, but not anymore, not in the past year. So when it comes to small business loans, when it comes to community development and economic development, some of the most exciting things in the country that are most interesting things that I've got to cover in the past couple of years have been workers buying businesses from their owners. A lot of it is happening in Cleveland. They're buying weatherization companies. They're buying small like construction and other companies, restaurants. And the owners, they want to retire. They don't really have much to save up. They're a small business owner, but there are groups that have figured out, let me see if the workers can pool the money together, buy the business from the owner, and now when the owner retires, the business doesn't close. There's 10,000 people retire a day. 10,000 baby boomers retire a day. A lot of them are small business owners. A lot of businesses are closing just because the owners are retiring, not because they're unprofitable. These are totally healthy, sustainable, profitable businesses, and the owners want to retire. And that's something where the Small Business Administration, whoever is going to be the next SBA administrator, will have the opportunity to. I mean, they're not guaranteed to do anything about this, but they have the opportunity to say, all right, I'm the Small Business Administration head, maybe I'm the Secretary of Commerce. The Secretary of Commerce has hundreds of revolving loan funds around the country that the Secretary of Commerce could help cities to use so that workers can buy businesses from retiring owners. That's all out there. And, you know, my job is to tell folks that those opportunities exist. I can't guarantee or promise that any of it's going to happen, but this moment right now, between now and January, and between January, whenever we know that there's a Senate, and then after that, you know, these are just some of the things that are federal. These are just federal things I'm talking about. You know, and that's why these elections matter, and these votes matter. Who's in the White House matters. And you know, I'm not going to lie to you and say I'm totally nonpartisan as a person, but you know, even within the Democratic Party, there's a wide spectrum of options for who could be the next Treasury Secretary, who could be the next Labor Secretary. And they're not all guaranteed to care about worker-owned businesses.
True. There's such a big spread. We're going to talk about that a little bit later when it comes to big ideas and what's going to take hold in a big enough way to move the needle ideologically with monetary policy. We'll get there. Another point on big ideas, Catherine, this is where I'd love to hear your voice here. If you've heard it once, you've heard it 1,000 times. In cities across America, we heard and know that Black voters, in particular, Black women, won the day with this election. Black women voting something between 92 to 93% for a Biden-Harris ticket. Catherine, what are the big ideas you sense deeply resonated and animated Black voters during this election cycle? Because of course it was not an Obama Biden ticket. It was a Biden-Harris ticket. So what were the big ideas this cycle that motivated so many to come out and exercise their right to vote?
I'd like to believe that humanity caused so many of us to get out and vote. My husband and I chose to go vote early, and there was a first-time voter in his 40s in the room with us. You know, we think of the celebrities, the Black celebrities who are over 40, over 50, who voted for the first time. That and we all have a heart. We all are human to human. And women are mothers. Women are caretakers. Women, even those of us who may have the most A-type personality in that framework, still know that when we all move positively together, that there's going to be a change that comes with it, and that we have to stand up and speak for our voice. I also believe that there are many women in that voting block that are in the age frame where I am, where they have relatives who literally risked their lives, and some lost their lives for the right to vote. You know, my mother didn't officially have the right to vote until after I was born. And in this administration, in the leadership of our government, there is a change and a reduction of what that actually means. Why can it, this is a tangent, but when will it be that it doesn't have to be reaffirmed every few years to ensure that I have a right to vote? It shouldn't be up for question. It shouldn't be up for debate. And I believe that too was part of the cause that got women and men to come out and say enough.
And so this is just it. It is up for debate, apparently, that not every vote matters. And one of the questions that I struggle with in terms of civic engagement is, how can we actuate the everyday citizen to come to the polls with the sense that they're safeguarding our democracy? I mean, I understand that democracy is sort of this aspirational term, right? We've never really truly achieved a full democracy. For us, it's, again, it's the mountaintop, it's the summit. But how can we actuate common citizenry to use their voices? I can see you want to jump in on this, Elizabeth. To safeguard our democracy so that we can vote and guard against these really very powerful machines, political machines and operatives who must subvert and undermine the vote to benefit one party over another. Elizabeth, can you talk about that, your thoughts on that?
Sure. I think first and foremost is we have to look at systemic voter disenfranchisement, right? From the beginning, women were not allowed to vote, Black people were not allowed to vote, Native Americans, Indigenous people were not allowed to vote. And that was for a reason. We know that our vote is our power. And so I really feel like once the Black Power movement started and really gained a lot of steam in the early 60s, and we won the Voting Rights Act in the early 60s, it scared the powers that be, because Black people were becoming more enlightened and more engaged about the power that the vote has. And we fought for that, we struggled for it, and we won. And praise to our ancestors for what they did to make sure that I'm able to access the ballot. But just because we won does not mean that the structures and systems that are in place are just going to go, you won, good job, all right, I guess go ahead and do all the things that we were trying to get you not to do for the 300 and some odd years that you were here. So it's key for us to be able to educate everyday folks like myself. There's nothing special about me. I just got organized. There was someone who talked to me in a language that I could understand, who helped me understand political engagement and educated me about policies, educated me about building power, educated me about engaging my community. And that's the only reason why I am where I am right now. And so we have to figure out, how do we do short snippets of civic engagement and education on TikTok? How are we training these 18-year-olds who love to listen to a good banger, right? But instead of having it be about something else, it's actually about voting and why voting matters. And we also have to deprogram ourselves from feeling like no matter what I do, it's not going to make a difference. And I think that is the biggest thing. I always think back to Bob Marley's that verse where he says, emancipate yourself from mental slavery. None but ourselves can free our mind, right? Like, we have not been in shackles, physical shackles, for 150 some odd years, but we have been in mental shackles for so much longer. And we've been taught that one person is not enough to change things. We've been taught that you have to reach superstar level like Martin Luther King or Brother Malcolm X in order to change things, but it's not true. The thing that we've got to do is reach out to our neighbors, connect with our friends, connect with my nephews like I do, connect with our nieces, connect with whoever you can, and train them and teach them that we are stronger when we're together. We're stronger when we're united. We might not always agree, but it don't matter. The thing that really matters is that we can figure out what our base values are and make sure that we're voting for those base values, because people are voting on their values.
Yeah.
And some people's values are to make sure that we don't have none.
Well, you've named so many things right now, Elizabeth. You named white supremacy and racism. We haven't even gotten to that little bit of this big equation. But not only that, but this idea of rugged individualism and sowing cynicism, this is a function of white supremacy and racism, right? This idea that you can go it alone, and that's the way you get things done. When we encourage people to act collectively, that's where the power is. And so that messaging and that rhetoric has had incredible impacts in the Black community. And I'll give you a really good example. You talk about young people. I have a beloved cousin in my family, business owner, I mean, just together. And, you know, we have family calls every Sunday. He said, I'm not voting. And my aunt, who was a political operative, was like, "Er, excuse me?" But instead of laying the downward pressure, she asked him, identify one issue that means something to you. And he is in healthcare in some respects. And so he researched it. And that was what activated him to vote, right? And so you're talking about educating our young people, having them pick one issue, right? To keep them engaged and trying to work against the rugged individualism that has so deeply embedded itself into our cultural ethos. But I want to bring Catherine into this for a little bit, because I'm curious about so many things with respect to just the local community's voice. Okay, so when we think about Cincinnati, we live in a city where, we pulled out these great Democratic wins, right? We seem to be this oasis of sort of, I don't know, progressive politics amongst a sea of red. And yet, we have really one good example that I can point to in the building of a local soccer stadium that not only made inruns around a historically Black community, but disenfranchised an entire legacy of Black citizens in Cincinnati. Can you talk about that example and how we can transmute that lesson into igniting the kind of civic involvement, political involvement that can not just give rhetorical power to Black people alongside their allies, but actual tangible power to overcome development that's not serving us and overcome development of soccer stadium that we don't need. Can you talk a little bit about that?
We could be here the rest of the evening talking about the development process in Cincinnati. And before I even start talking about the soccer statement, I must acknowledge that that's the second time that's happened to the community. There was a thriving Black community that had all of the AMI ratings that we would have today, living there, the corner store, the manufacturing, it was all there. And it was wiped out because they were going to rebuild that was going to enhance the Black community. It wasn't rebuilt. So we have the stadium that it wasn't the location, in my recollection, wasn't the first place that it was the choice, but it ended up being in this predominantly African-American community where some concessions were made and businesses were moved out and shut down and lost. And there was engagement from the residents in the community. And yet those conversations didn't always land on listening ears. And what I say is that this is to occur, the next step is that there is an urban overlay plan that is going to be discussed at the city planning department on Friday, to talk about density and how dense the new developments can come in and for their height weights and how many apartments. And there are people who are saying, you have not listened to us. You have not listened to the residents and what we as the residents are wanting to be in our community. And yet there are lobbyists for developers who have the ability to engage in conversation with city staff, in addition to elected city council and mayors, to have what they believe that is going to be for the bottom line of the city to get taxed. And so when you add, if there's a pandemic going on, we've lost some of our tax base. We need, we need money for the city to move forward on. But at the cost of what and whom are we doing that?
Yeah, I have this theory. Oscar, I kind of want to test it on you. And I have this theory that if we if we were to allocate funding on a local city level that would pay for lobbyists, professionalize it, how can the way I'm putting it, how can we bring K Street to Clifton Avenue? How can we bring K Street to Fountain Square in Cincinnati? In other words, how can we harness the power of sophisticated advocacy at a local level? And I'm talking about Walnut Hills community neighborhood level that can help ignite this power, this sort of collective voice. Do you think that has any bearing right now as we're sort of at the precipice of harnessing political power and voice? Is there something there?
I think the ideas are there in these neighborhoods like Walnut Hills, other historically Black or predominantly communities of color across the country. I think the ideas are there because if there wasn't, I wouldn't have a job. Like it's
right.
Primarily what I'm writing about are models and policies for economic development in places like Walnut Hills or over the Rhine or Englewood in Chicago or Grandmont Rosedale or Livernois in Detroit. I'm writing about what are the policies, what are the models for investing in Black-owned housing on the north side of St. Louis or in Pittsburgh, in Black neighborhoods of Pittsburgh, like the Hill District or Homewood. And the ideas are there. And it's not so much about better ideas or better data. I mean, it matters. Data would be great to have for some of these things to prove what's working and just to hold institutions and organizations accountable. But better data is not going to make for policies that are more supportive of Black communities by itself. And just better ideas somehow by itself. What I'm starting to see, because I've been doing this now for about 5 years, and the longer I'm doing it, then the more history I get to tap into and understand, and not just the histories going back to the slavery era or the Pre-Construction era or the Great Migration era, but history going back, let's just say maybe 10 years, and thinking about a neighborhood like the Hill District in Pittsburgh, that just now is the model for Pittsburgh to develop Black neighborhoods for Black people by Black people in Pittsburgh. It took about 10 years of organizing to get to that point, right? The Hill District CDC, Marima Millions in that neighborhood, and all the other organizations. It's not just Hill District CDC, but they're one of the big ones that have been organizing around development in the Hill District. If you're in Cincinnati, you think of the Hill District as over the Rhine. It's right next to downtown. It was also ravaged by urban renewal, and it's also starting to feel some of the gentrification pressure. And yeah, they in 2011, the Hill District CDC and a bunch of other organizations got the funding, scrounged together the funding from all different sources to create the Hill District master plan. And then 4 years later, they created the Center Avenue commercial corridor design plan. So this is like focusing on one of the main historic commercial corridors. And now, a couple of weeks ago, actually, the city of Pittsburgh announced the Avenues of Hope initiative. And the city basically said, yeah, what we've been doing in the Hill District, now we want to do that in the other Black neighborhoods in Pittsburgh, Hazelwood and Homewood. And I get to write about it because, finally, part of that story is at one corner of Center Avenue, at 2178 Center Avenue in Pittsburgh, from 1971 to 2011, it was Hammond Barbershop, Black-owned barbershop. Didn't just own the barbershop. Walter Ham owned the building, right? Owned the building, owned the barbershop, was there for 40 years. He died unexpectedly in 2011. Barbershop closed. His wife sold the building to the city. Now the city is about to sell that building to Thomas Boyd. Grew up in the Hill District, became a barber, grew up going to Ham's, looking up to Walter Ham. Now he's a barber, opened his own shop in 2005, and now he's going to try to buy this building in the city. That shouldn't just be a one-time thing, right? That should be the way it goes.
Well,
and
opportunity zones is another thing. You know, we hear this word,
oh,
right, a lot, and I want to try and like boil it down to, like you said, that your whole job is to let people know about these opportunities, right? How can we be sure that that story is trickled down to people who can take advantage of that in their own cities and lead the way?
how can
we
opportunity?
ensure, how can we ensure that
Oh,
stories are shared as broadly as possible to inspire people in other cities across the country to be sure that these properties are handed down to people who are historically disenfranchised?
well, that's why I bring up the 10 years of organizing that went into the Hill District Master Plan. It started with the Hill District Master Plan. It's been about 10 years since they finished it. And it's been constantly going back to that plan, you know, having a plan and then having it be community driven, and then having it, you know, that takes resources, you know, to a Black-led organization like the Hill District CBC in a Black neighborhood. It takes resources to do that. And then to create the plan, and it takes resources to hold every institution accountable for saying, hey, look, we talked about this in 2011. Remember, like, per our conversation last year, 2 years ago, 3 years ago, 5 years ago, 10 years ago. Remember, we talked about this. We didn't just want a barbershop at this corner. We wanted a Black-owned barbershop owned by someone in the neighborhood to own this building at this corner. And that's just one building on the corner. I mean, it's the rest of the corridor that they're working on. But like, it takes resources to do that. And I'm just talking about that example because I've been reporting on it for the past couple of weeks, and the story's going to come out on Thursday. But like, I could do something similar in parts of Over the Rhine, or, you know, I'd love to do it on Walnut Hills at some point. You know, the idea, you know, the press conference that Pittsburgh had a couple of weeks ago, you know, if you look at the headlines, all it says is Pittsburgh is investing in Black neighborhoods. You don't get to see the 10 years of work that went into shaping what it looks like to invest in Black neighborhoods in a way that doesn't look like urban renewal, that doesn't look like a stadium coming out of nowhere. You know, that stadium story, that happened to the Hill District in 1961. Cleared out 8,000 homes and 400 businesses in the Hill District to build a stadium for the Pittsburgh Penguins. That happened. And it's not just as Pittsburgh, you know, it happened in St. Louis, you know, the Gateway Arch, beautiful. What was it before there was Gateway Arch? It was a Black neighborhood. Lincoln Center in New York City. What was it before Lincoln Center? It was a Black neighborhood. I can go on and on. You know, this is you know, but there was a beautiful neighborhood called Black Bottom in Detroit, or Black Wall Street in Tulsa. I mean, they didn't just burn down Black Wall Street in Tulsa. Later, they built a highway through it. So you can't even rebuild Black Wall Street right now unless you tear down the highway. Like, that story is, and all these things I'm talking about are all, you know, just come back to the topic. Everything I've talked about either was funded by the federal government, or now in Pittsburgh, it's like, what, are they going to get some of this federal funding? You know, they got the federal funding to build the stadium in the Hill District. Are they going to get the federal funding to restore Black ownership to the Hill District? I don't know yet. I mean, because I don't know what's going to happen to the Senate. I don't know. In Cincinnati, you know, with this stadium, that's getting some federal funding, right? Like, that's in an opportunity zone. This is getting opportunity zone tax breaks for investors. The stadium is eligible for these tax breaks.
Right. And the way these opportunity zones are even structured, they leave out an entire socioeconomic class of individuals. And so to hear it trumpeted over and over again as this incredible opportunity, I think really does betray the reality on the ground. And that is, unless you've got, you know, your networks with some high-powered financiers and things like that, you are, you know, your opportunity is dead in the water.
Well, I don't want to go on too long with this because I'll go on all night about this, but it's worse than betray the reality on the ground. It's co-opts the narrative that's on the ground, because you can go into a Black Chamber of Commerce anywhere in the country, and they'll tell you, we need more than loans in our community. We need equity. You know, we need those private equity investors to really scale up our businesses. And in some ways that's true, but not every private equity investor is the same. Some of them only view your neighborhood as a gold mine for them to extract wealth from. Absolutely.
Well, from time immemorial, this has been the story of Black communities, extraction and
extraction. And so what you hear about with opportunity zones isn't just disregarding the reality that's on the ground. It's taking a kernel of what Black communities and other marginalized communities are asking for, and using it in service. You know, taking that kernel and putting it on the front cover of a playbook that is built for entirely something else.
Let's forecast a little bit more as a group. Elizabeth, in particular, I'd like to get your standpoint on what do you see coming down the pike in terms of policy that can help not only undo the damage of the last 4 years in disenfranchising historically disenfranchised people even more than they had been, but also building better futures for all people, especially for the people who need the most help. What do you see?
I think a lot about the criminal justice system. I think about the impact that the criminal justice system has on our communities. I mean, we all know the statistics that Black and brown boys and girls are far more likely to end up in prison, far more likely to have run-ins in school. We look at the school to prison pipeline. There's been movement in Cincinnati around the school to prison pipeline. There's been movement in Columbus about getting Columbus City Police out of Columbus City schools. I know there was a group that was really working hard here in Cincinnati to get CPD out of CPS. And I think one of the things that I genuinely believe could really transformationally impact our communities is bail reform. The ACLU has been looking at bail reform as one of our key issues for the past 3 years. And what we're finding is that bail reform has such a high human toll that we don't account for. So we think of somebody getting picked up on the streets for whatever it could be, right? A lot of times these folks aren't charged with very much of anything, but Cincinnati, the Hamilton County Justice System or Justice Center typically has between 60 to 70% of people who are waiting inside of that detention center pre-trial. And the human toll on our communities, people are losing jobs, people are losing children, people are losing family, and they're locked away before they're even found guilty. So I think if we want to get serious about equalizing the playing field, looking at criminal justice reform as one of those things, right? We need broad scale reform. I also want to look at the impact on what's happening right now with our environment. We can look at places like Winton Terrace and the struggle of the residents of Winton Terrace to just get the county to even look at what's happening with roach infestation, what's happening with the crazy high rates of asthma that kids are suffering from, what's happening with diabetes inside of Winton Terrace. And a lot of that is from the chemical fallout of the chemical plants that are right next to those communities. And we know historically, Black and brown communities, planned communities, are surrounded by these chemical plants and are surrounded by these ecological disasters. And so I think that the new administration, there's a lot of different opportunities for us to organize around our health. And I'm not just talking about our physical health, I'm talking about our mental health, right? Making sure that we've got transformational funding in mental health. As the Black community starts to embrace mental health more than we historically have, knowing that generational trauma is real, knowing that post-traumatic slave syndrome is real, knowing that, we've got young kids walking around who've seen their best friends get shot in the street, and the PTSD that has, the effects of that has on people, we've got to take those things seriously. And so with the county commissioners that we have, with the judges that we have, even putting the full court press on the prosecutor that we have to say, we want to make sure that we are radically transforming the laws and policies inside of our county, inside of our city, to make sure that they reflect the wholeness and the health that we want our folks to have. You can't keep coming to our communities when you need to get elected. You need to be coming to our communities after you get elected to make good on those promises, or we'll be coming to you to make sure that you're doing what you promised to do. And I think that's key. And those are some of the opportunities that I see. I know there's a lot more. Like, I think of Cam Hardy and the work that he's been doing with the Metro, right? And the new Metro station that we have in Northside now. Like, Cam is one of my heroes. And I just think about how that 40 to 60,000 jobs, they're inaccessible right now by public transit. How, as we continue to expand our reach with the public transit, that people will actually be able to get high paying jobs, sustainable living jobs, where our families and our communities won't suffer as much.
Thank you for that forecast. I love that forecast. Very clear, very focused. Catherine, I'm going to ask you to weigh in with a similar question. You held up the smiley face. Love it. I'm going to ask you a similar question, but ask you to kind of ground it in Walnut Hills. What's your vision for what Walnut Hills will look like 5-10 years down the road as a result of an informed, engaged citizenry, neighborhoods, and electorate? What's your vision for what that could all look like?
When you enter Walnut Hills, it says a diverse neighborhood since 1800. And we are fortunate that we have residents, long-term and short-term, that understand what that means. That diversity is what makes Walnut Hills, which has location, a place to be. But what it means for us 5 years, 10 years down the road, that tenacity that residents have had, that provided that the streets, because McMillan and Taft were one way, that was a 20-year conversation with the city to get our streets to go back to two-way streets. And since that two-way streets, you see the businesses that have blossomed from that, because we know, as Oscar could give us the statistics of how many businesses close because of you go down the one-way street and you can't come back around it. But we also, as a community, we say that we are collaborative. So when we talk about the education that's occurring in Walnut Hills, we have preschool, like our Divine Daycare, but we also have the Union Institute. We have a magnet school, we have a neighborhood school, we have charter schools. And at our community council, they all communicate to the neighborhood that show up to that conversation, what is happening inside of that building, how they could have assistance from the residents. And also the community has an expectation that they are going to collaborate, that it is not going to be a food drive here, a book drive here, that we're going to collaborate as a community. But also with that, it comes, how are we going to collaborate for an education? Walnut Hills is home to the Harriet Beecher Stowe House. There is history here. We have the Colored Women's Home here. We have many places that were on the Green Book that are coming back. The Man's Hotel is now become senior low-income housing in relationship with Episcopal Retirement Service and the Model Group that is going to have a mural, public art on it that is going to be designed with collaboration of the community and artworks. So those are collaboration is what will continue to happen. And the largest collaboration that is going to happen in the next 5 to 10 years is that the building that was Kroger's and that parking lot, there's been change that has happened in this year, that there is now the development. What is that development going to look like? It's 3 acres in what I call downtown Walnut Hills.
Yep.
How are we going to equitably? I've made it perfectly clear that my expectation is when that new building is built, that we will have all of the spectrum of rental rates in that building.
Absolutely.
All of the spectrum.
Yeah.
Below 30, 30 to 60, 60 to 80, 80 to 120 and over. All. Because that's what makes it equitable. That the reflection of the businesses that come in will really reflect who it is. My belief is that as we have our community gardens and our community orchards in the neighborhood, and those will just keep flourishing. We have flower pots on our corners that has Swiss chard in them. You need a little food? Here's our Swiss chard. We have someone who gets up every day in this neighborhood and his focus is, how do we bring food? So we currently don't have a grocery store, but we have Food Forest, which is a delivery that delivers from 4 different Findlay Market and 3 different grocery stores to make a delivery. How do we bring that technology into this new technology phase to make sure that a resident that is on that has the SNAP card and someone who has the Platinum Visa card can all get their groceries delivered, and it's all equitable and looking the same. So that's what I see, because Walnut Hills is location, location, location. Walnut Hills is history. Our Harriet Beecher Stowe House is underway now. The Cincinnati Art Museum, which is located in Walnut Hills, put steps coming right into the neighborhood off of that hillside. So their back is no longer to it. Cincinnati Ballet is right across the street. That we have an arts group that's really talking about how do we use creative placemaking? How do we use the arts to make development occur for our neighborhood? So when I look at what's happening in Walnut Hills, it's authenticity, it's transparency, it's collaboration, and it is going to be exactly what we've been, that we get to continue to be.
I love hearing you talk about the vision, and it's so clear to me that that ethos is living and breathing throughout the neighborhood of Walnut Hills. You can walk down the street and see Brick House, which is sort of a storefront of Mortar, which is a nonprofit organization that helps uplift mostly Black women entrepreneurs. And so you see that, and you see it reflected. And I can tell that you leading this work along with your fellow neighborhood citizens, is that what you call them? Neighborhoodians, are doing incredible work. And I have a lot of hope that that story will be a model for what we can do nationally on a national.
And I'll just interject that it has, I'm sorry, Oscar, but let me just say that it's the collaboration. It is I will say that I am grateful that I am the president at this moment in time, someone who, no matter what strength finders that you take, my number one skill set is collaboration, connectedness, because of that, so that I can see that I want my neighbor who's in the $1.5 million home having a conversation with someone who's only making $12,000 a year, because we all ultimately want the same thing: safe, clean communities in which to live, that the services that we need are there for us. And that when we have a need, whether it's that we need the fire department to come, the police department to come, or a neighbor to come hold our hand while we're going through something traumatic, that you can find that, and that it's not that you're singled out, that it's equitable for all of us that live here. And I am very fortunate that I have many people who don't have the same beliefs as I do, that live in this neighborhood, that are as engaged as I am. And that's what makes this a win-win, that we have those divergent perspectives at the table, making the decision. So the win-win really is for everybody in this community. Thank you, Oscar.
Oh no, I'm glad you brought. I'm glad these are all great points you make, and it just makes me even more excited to add to it by saying, and I don't want to minimize the work that you're doing in Walnut Hills, or the work that anyone is doing in any neighborhood like this across the country. I don't say this to minimize what you're doing. It's what you do. All these neighborhoods have such unique and beautiful histories and people who are working on all these initiatives and ideas and projects that you're talking about. So I don't say this to minimize what you're doing, but I'm here in this conversation to tell everyone, in every neighborhood you might think is falling apart, this work is happening.
Yes.
In every city across the country. And I don't just say that anecdotally. I just don't just say that anecdotally, because these numbers are a few months behind, but from 2015 to the middle of this year, 2015 to I want to say May of 2020, I've reported more than 400 stories for Next City. And in 180 of them, I quoted at least one Black person. In 61 of them, I quoted at least one Asian person. In 74 of them, at least one person, at least one Latino person. I've interviewed more than 900 people from 2015 till this year. 33% of them are Black, 11% are Latino, 1% Indigenous, 11% Asian, and 44% are white. I mean, I talk to a lot of banks and policymakers. They tend to still be white folks, but in every neighborhood across the country, I can give you the spreadsheet that shows you, this is the stuff I write about, and guess what they look like, guess where they're from, guess who they are. Like this work is happening. So I'm sort of here to kind of connect those dots and just say, like, you don't necessarily need a lobbyist necessarily. You just need to go out to those neighborhoods, talk to people, and take them seriously. Like they're smart. They care more about these neighborhoods than you believe. And it's almost like, another way of putting it is, going out and talking with them and taking them seriously is what the system has done for years on the golf course, right? Like, for how many generations has local policy and economic development been conducted, on the golf course of the yacht club, or wherever it is that the mayor and the biggest banker in town and the biggest employer in town, hang out. If we're going to try to create policies and a vision for cities that comes out of a different place, go out to those neighborhoods and take everyone seriously. They've got ideas, and they're going to they're already putting in the work to make it happen. So you just have to get in line, get information.
Yes, let's get information. Before we open it up to questions from the audience, I just want to remind those watching in Facebook world that you too should ask questions of our guests. We're going to open it up in just a few minutes, but I want to come back to elections a little bit and talk about, like, the intersection of elections with the exchange of ideas. One of the amazing benefits that I see that comes with a changing of the guard politically is that we are exposed to new ideas. And I've been thinking a lot about economic policy lately because I've been studying economics, and the person who is shaping my view, at least academically, right, theoretically, about our economic structure in this country has been Glenn Hubbard. It's like pretty narrow, right? But of course, this is the sort of chosen ideas, right? That happens to be at my institution. Oscar, I want to know from your standpoint, who are some of the alternatives that you are seeing that are casting forward new ideas, using some, solid economic principles and theories, but opening up the floodgates of ideas that hopefully can permeate into a new administration and bear out in policy, maybe law if we flip the Senate. Who and what are those new ideas that you are seeing?
Let me let me disappoint you first of all and say not every idea is new. That I want that could be or should be or might be worth taking a look at right now. The some of these ideas like postal banking, having every post office offer bank accounts, savings accounts, maybe even small dollar loans as a service. That sounds kind of radical, kind of crazy, for some of us, like the post office banking, really. But guess what? From 1910 to 1966, you could go open a bank account with the post office, and there were so many. I won't give you the numbers because the numbers are meaningless now because of inflation. But let me just tell you, there was enough money saved up at the post office that it spooked the big banks, and they were like, we have to have that money. Like you can't have the post office hold all those deposits. We need those deposits, because we want to mine this economy for gold, and deposits are when we do that. So in 1966, we shut down postal banking in the U.S. and we never reopened it. There's a great author. Her name is Mirza Baradaran. She's a big proponent of postal banking. Her first book is called How the Other Half Banks. She also wrote a more recent book called The Color of Money. That's the history of Black banks and the racial wealth gap, which kind of goes into, speaking of like historically marginalized or Black communities have always been doing the work. Black banks have been pushing hard and doing lots of hard and important work for a long time. And it's good work, it's important work, but it's done nothing to close the racial wealth gap. And there's a reason for that. And the book gets into it. And so I'd recommend, if in some dream world where I'm on, where maybe I'm on cable news or something, and I'm forced to give who's my dream treasury secretary, it will probably be Mirza Baradaran. There's also, if I had a dream HUD secretary, I'm just looking at the books on my shelf, honestly. My dream HUD secretary would be Keeanga Yamada Taylor, who recently wrote Race for Profit, which is about how all the ways housing and urban development policy have gone wrong because of race in the 20th century, up until today, really, in the 21st century too, with a big focus on the 70s and 80s, when housing policy really shifted away from federal government funding to private funding of affordable housing, and all the different little ways that brokers and mortgage lenders, screwed Black folks out of their homes in the 60s, 70s, and 80s, and are still doing it today. Keeanga Yamada Taylor, so she has Race for Profit. There's also the Deficit Myth is a book that came out this year, written by her name is Stephanie Kelton, and she's an economist now at Stony Brook University, and she has a few other positions. She's worked for Senate Democrats as a chief economist. Bernie Sanders brought her in to be in that role, and she has this book called The Deficit Myth. And I'll introduce it. It's not really her idea. It's in the book, I really like the book as a journalist because she really gets into like, where did these ideas come from? Like, who are the people? And frankly, there's a bunch of white men in the book who are like, I thought, I was sitting in my Wall Street firm doing whatever, and I realized, oh my gosh, the Federal Reserve creates money out of thin air. Like, those kinds of revelations. And she went to talk with them and got to know them, and just, she talks about it in the book. I recommend reading the book. But let me tell you how this book is popping up in policy that matters to this discussion. Recently, a coalition of mayors across the country got together around the idea of universal basic income. Starting with Michael Tubbs out in Stockton, California, who, by the way, is in the re-election fight of his life right now. Michael Tubbs, a couple of years ago, got a lot of headlines for starting a basic income experiment in Stockton. Now LA is doing one. San Francisco has a basic income for artists program. Melvin Carter, the mayor of St. Paul, was also on this call. The mayor of Newark, New Jersey, Ras Baraka, was on this call. And I got to ask a question as a member of the press about, okay, well, do you guys think, how do you guys feel like you're going to pay for that? You're going to face the question of how can the federal government or anyone afford to pay for basic income? And because really, it's not going to be state and local or private funding that does universal basic income. It's going to be federal dollars. And so I asked the question, how do you feel about you're going to be confronted with the question of how can we afford this? Our national debt is bigger than it's ever been. And Ras Baraka said something pretty astounding, I would say, for fiscal policy in the US. Ras Baraka said, just print the money, just create the money. We can do it. Why don't we just do it for this? That was his answer to the question. And it can really be that simple. The Federal Reserve has the power to create money out of thin air. You can Google that phrase and you can find a PBS story about, yes, the Federal Reserve does create money out of thin air. And I can tell you just this year, between the end of March and the end of April, the federal government created $3 trillion out of thin air. The Federal Reserve created $3 trillion out of thin air. That wasn't to fund the CARES Act. That wasn't to fund those checks. I mean, that came later. The $3 trillion I'm talking about is a $3 trillion that came out of nowhere to buy a bunch of mortgage-backed securities and treasuries off of Wall Street. The Federal Reserve printed $3 trillion, created it with a few strokes of the keyboard, because it's not really printing money anymore. They're just typing lines in a spreadsheet. The Federal Reserve created $3 trillion out of nowhere and handed it to Wall Street in the blink of an eye, over the few strokes of the keyboard.
Yeah.
And now mayors, council members, legislators across the country, Rashida Tlaib up in Detroit is one of the leaders in the federal government who is saying, guys, because it's still mostly guys, let's print out, let's make sure state and local governments don't have to fire teachers and firefighters and other essential workers, garbage workers. Let's make sure that none of those folks have to get fired by creating the money. Just create the money, because we can do it. The national, and if you want to understand,
is the will to do it.
The question is the will, and the book Deficit Myth will get into, like, well, how do you fight back? How do you argue back against, like, we can't just print the money, we have to borrow it from China? And like, no, false. We do not have to borrow it from China. We don't have to borrow it at all. I mean, we sell treasury bonds, we sell debt, but as a federal government, but we don't have to borrow the money.
So we have a question from the audience. We're going to pivot a little bit, and you guys, looks like we've got a question from Ben in Bloomington. Is that Ben Jacob in Bloomington? One of our loyal followers of Urban Consulate. Hello, Ben Jacob. Ben says, focusing on intervening before the established investor class can buy out businesses that could be purchased by its employee and swallowing up economically disenfranchised properties and then gentrifying them with highways and even art centers that I might otherwise support. Seems like a pretty critical means for addressing what he's calling the top-down end of the situation. How and where can we best apply our energies of these kinds of inflection points beyond just voting? It's pretty important. And economically supporting those sectors as individuals alone. I'm going to turn this over to Elizabeth.
Woo! All right. So I'm going to do my best.
What other options are there apart from voting?
Yeah, definitely. So as Oscar was talking and responding to the last question, I got to thinking about the Ujima project in Boston. And I see some nods and some shaking of the heads, which is very exciting to me. So, Ben, I think one of the things that could be key is supporting things like the Ujima Project. And what Ujima is it is a community investment fund. And we can create funds with anything, right? We can create funds with $50. You can create a fund as long as you're able to pay for the filing fee and find what you need to find on the business end of things. But what Ujima does is it has memberships where folks are investing inside of this community fund. And then you get to vote on what you are impacting and what you're investing in and how your money actually impacts the local community. I think that's one thing that's really key. I'm also thinking about Pastor Lynch here in Cincinnati with New Prospect Baptist Church and what is it? It is the Community Economic Advancement Initiative. And part of what Pastor Lynch is so brilliant at doing is finding ways for the Black community specifically to be able to reach for those opportunity zones, to reach for the nuggets that the government gives out a lot of times that we miss, though, right? And so there are ways inside of our community where we can make sure that we're working with the port to get blighted properties and where we're crowdsourcing to reopen those blighted properties, to remodel them and make sure that they're livable and then rent them to other community members. One of the things that the Black community, and I think lots of communities, but I'm thinking about the Black community, has been really good at is having a community bank, right? Or family bank, as we like to call it in my family, where we know that if I don't have the $500 I need right now, my sister probably has it and I can get it from her. And then when she needs it, I can give it to her. It's how do we get back to these community economics where we realize that we're all in it together and that when you come up, I come up too. I don't have like some technical answer for that, but
but we don't need technical answers. Let's just keep it simple, because I think part of the story is that making these changes aren't as complex as we make them out to be, right? It starts with relationships. It starts with building bridges. It starts with collective action. Catherine, I'm going to get you to chime in on this. What other tools or actions are available to people outside of voting and monetary support to address some of these top-down issues?
I say, if you live in a neighborhood, I'm going to take a step back. Regardless of what city you live in, go to that city's website and find out how the neighborhood organizes, and then find out where you are in that organized chart, and then go to those meetings and hear what is being said and get involved at that level. Because I think back to my early days of volunteering in Walnut Hills, many times it was organizing the book drive or the Walnut Hills Day. And these days it's being involved in conversations that are dealing with policy. So there's always a way for you at the local level that ultimately, yes, it's attached to voting because there's the election of that, but the difference that you can make in your neighborhood when your neighborhood collaborates. And when I say your neighborhood collaborates, it's not just the residents, it's the CDC in your neighborhood, it's the business group in your neighborhood. Here in Walnut Hills, we have what's called the working group, and the working group meets once a month to talk about not just the development challenges in our neighborhood or that's coming through. It says, Elizabeth said, with the Port Authority, you can go to the Port Authority's website and see what land, what houses are available for purchase, and you can submit your plan of what you'd like to do with that. So it's having those conversations that all of those entities come together and are on the same page when they go to the city to have a conversation. Because as someone who's lived through being a resident of Walnut Hills when the three entities were not collaborative and were going to the city as individuals, a big change from then until now when we go collectively to the city for a conversation. And again, it's about all of us wanting the same for our neighborhoods. We all want a place where we can go get the supplies that we need and to go have a little fun in our neighborhood so we don't have to drive. You know, there's the thing about the walkable neighborhoods. We truly do want that. And as I think to that, I think of, there are many neighborhoods, getting back to what you said, Naima, about and Oscar, about economics. You know, I had the pleasure of going to Case Western and got a Master of Science in Positive Organization Development and Change. And one of the things that came from that is that the Aim to Flourish project, which is really looking is how can business do good and still make a profit? And there are ways for that to happen. And the same can happen in communities. How can communities develop collectively so that businesses are thriving? Yes, Black, brown businesses, but also European businesses, own businesses, that we are all thriving. But there is something to be said that money needs to stay local, whether that's local here in Walnut Hills or in Bond Hill or over the Rhine. There's money that needs to stay local, as well as money needs to stay in the county, so that it's how do you build that up? You know, I think of friends who are highlighting, I've spent my dollar in the Black business today, and where they go, and the conversations. And we all can't, the reality is it's not just giving a check mark about it. We have to critique businesses to help them flourish and develop and grow.
Yeah.
Because the ultimate is that some of these businesses that are opening up in our business district, I want to see them move and open up a second shop in another neighborhood. Just as Kroger is in multitude of neighborhoods, I want to see Jess Kewen in a multitude of neighborhoods, or the Pickled Pig in a multitude of neighborhoods. You know, I want to see that happen, or Soul Palette has their own brick and mortar where you can come. You know, I want to see all of that happening, and it can happen.
Absolutely.
But it's, you know, we need to be collaborative in it.
Oscar, I'm going to turn it over to you now.
Yeah, I'll add one little thing you could do. Well, let me first reemphasize, go to these neighborhoods, find the CDCs, find the local chapters, neighborhood chapters of ACLU or whoever might, find the community organizers. You don't have to agree with everything they're saying or pushing, but if you go and you listen, you will find a way to support something that they're doing, because, you know, you can ask Catherine, the CDC is doing everything. You don't like what they're doing for workforce development, pushing a minimum wage, and like, okay, then show up for a small business meeting. I don't know. There's something else they're doing that you probably would support. That's number one, but I already said that earlier. So let me just add one more thing. Here's one more thing you could do. Start with Google whatever city name you're in. Google, put the name and put in one more word. Put in disposition. Since you could do this, Cincinnati disposition, Pittsburgh disposition, Philadelphia disposition. I just did it just to make sure. What is disposition? Disposition, it may not be the first option that comes up, but it's going to be close to the top. Look for the option that seems to show disposition is the process by which cities give away public land that cities have taken over because of tax foreclosure or blight or abandonment or whatever. A lot of land ends up being owned by the city, and when the city gives it back, usually for $1 to the developer or fair market value or whatever. In New York City, we like to give away land for $1. You know, Pittsburgh does fair market value. That's nice. They actually get money back for it. So Google, whatever your city name is, Google disposition, and every city's disposition process has some kind of public input. It might be a meeting, it might be a commenting period. I don't know what it is, but it's different in every city. But there's a way for the public to have a say. Find the way for you to have a say in your city's disposition process, and then say, and whatever. This isn't ideological at all. All you have to ask is, for this neighborhood that you're giving away a property, is there a way for the residents of that neighborhood to, you know, get a shot at owning that property? The answer is going to be no, but you can ask that question every time. And that is the only way that I've ever seen a city find. And right now, again, I'm going back to Pittsburgh because I just wrote a story about it. It's coming out on Thursday, but that's the only way I've ever seen a city finally realize, oh my gosh, you're right. We need to stop giving the land away to just anybody. We need to give the residents around the neighborhood to these properties a chance to own those properties. Chicago.
So Oscar, I'm
is
going
the
to
same
interject
thing.
here, Oscar,
Mhm.
and say
Yeah.
that in Cincinnati, that will go to the Port Authority, and
Oh.
in Walnut Hills, one of the items that we have said is that the working group, we look at the property and we ask the question: have you asked the property owner who lives next door to it if they want to take ownership of that land? Because again, in Cincinnati, we're an old city, so there's small lots. And that has happened many times, that instead of a developer coming in to develop a infill housing, that the lot goes to the neighbor next door, and they now have parking, off-street parking.
And I gotta make a pitch to you, Oscar. You need to come to Cincinnati. It's not just Walnut Hills, but Price Hill.
Yeah.
Price Hill has an incredible story of just that. Price Hill has built up an incredible reputation for creative placemaking, right? Connecting with the community to identify needs first before developing anything. We would like for you to write about that story because it's absolutely astounding.
I'm due for a Cincinnati visit. The last time I was there was 2015. That's when I met the mortar guys.
Yeah. Oh, and the mortar people, that's just a whole different story. And our Cincinnati audience knows all about their great work.
I've done 3 stories about mortar in the past 5 years.
We've got so many other wonderful stories happening in Cincinnati, and we'd love for you to come back and write up something really nice. I'm actually going to transition us to a space of hope. This is a space when I asked us on our planning call last week, well, what's missing? And Catherine, the artist soul that she is, beautiful, said, we need to end this on a note of hope, right? It's a fraught time. So I'm going to start with you, Catherine. What is giving you hope in this moment?
This conversation is giving me hope. The more that we are transparent with the people that we come in contact with and really share information. I'm one who believes in you share what you know because you never know who needs that information. And as this time is unfolding, I am not only hopeful, I know it is true that there's a change coming, that there are little people who have observed this process and who are engaged. And there are elders in our community who have observed this process and they're still engaged. And there is still talk happening. It is not being silent. It is when there is silence, it is when the harm can be done. But as long as communication keeps occurring, as long as we keep putting one foot in front of the other and going into buildings and going into schools and going into the city council communities and saying, this is our expectation, this is what we need, this is what we believe, we stay hopeful. We keep moving it along.
So beautiful. Elizabeth, what's keeping you hopeful?
I think one of the things that is keeping me hopeful is the reflection that COVID has forced us all into. And it sounds counterintuitive because I know so many people are struggling right now with the pandemic and missing friends and missing our old way of life. But I lead with this question a lot in my organizing work, and it's what are the blessings and the gifts that quarantine has given you? And so many people, Catherine, every time you just trip me out. So many people really are taken aback by that. But I know in my personal life and in my friends' lives and in my family's lives, we have gotten so much more clear on what really matters, on who really matters, on how much we desire to be engaged, right? And we have to jump so many hoops and hurdles to be engaged now. So the people who show up to our organizing calls, they're there because they want to be there, even in the midst of a pandemic, in the midst of the struggle. They choose to be present. That's one of the things that's really giving me hope. And I think what's been birthed from the pandemic gives me hope. I think about the mutual aid networks that I've seen pop up across the nation. I think about how communities are really circling around people these days, whether it's you need help with paying for your rent, or you need food, or you don't have money to buy your dog food. People are posting these things on Facebook and in these mutual aid groups, and we're coming to each other's rescue. And to me, that is going to help shift the paradigm of the rugged individualism. Like, we know the government can suspend student loans. We know that now. You know, we know what's possible now. We know that we can enter into a place where there's universal income. We know that now. And it's lifted the lid so much on what's possible. And we will never forget what's possible. And so that's the part that gives me hope. Yes, it's more work. You know, I'm an organizer. I'm always thinking about what's the next thing. But it's just beautiful to see how we show up for each other in the midst of a pandemic, in the midst of this election, in the midst of the craziness. We continue to show up for each other. And like Catherine was saying, you know, we're humans, and it's our inclination, it's our tendency, it's our instinct to show up for each other. So.
How we show up to each other. I'm going to take that with me and hold it really close. Thank you, Elizabeth. And Oscar, you get the last word, my friend. What's keeping you hopeful?
I don't know why you gave me the last word, because I'm gonna be a little bit the Debbie Downer and say, you know, I don't get to hope or be hopeful necessarily. That's not how I would put it. What I get to be as a journalist is interested, and what keeps me interested is the work that Catherine and Elizabeth have talked about, their work that they've been doing. And the work that takes place in cities around the country that I have this privileged platform to cover as a journalist. It keeps me interested because there's never really an answer to the question of why does the work keep happening? And we'll never really have an answer to why, in the face of everything that has happened to Black women in this country, they keep doing what they do. Everything that has happened to queer folks in this country, especially queer folks of color or Indigenous folks in this country, for all that has happened to them, what is it that keeps them doing what they do? I don't know if we'll ever have an answer to that question, but they keep doing what they do, and that to me is interesting. My favorite book in the world is The Warmth of Other Suns by Isabel Wilkerson. And it's about the Great Migration. And my favorite line in that book comes in very early on in the book, where she's just sort of introducing the topic of the Great Migration and what is it. And she says what it is the Great Migration was the first big step the nation's working class ever took without asking permission. And it connected with me, it hit me as someone who is not Black, but someone who is coming from an immigrant background. You know, that's the story. Like, folks who are facing systemic oppression on so many levels, they always have been and will continue to do whatever it takes, not just to survive, but also to thrive. They're doing this work, and it's all I want to write about. And the fact that it just keeps happening, like, you know, I don't, it's the sacrifice we have to make as journalists. I don't get to call it hopeful, but I do get to say it keeps me interested, and that's what keeps me doing the work that I'm able to do.
Thank you. Thank you for that. It has been an absolute honor and privilege to sit in dialogue with each of you. You are teaching me a lot. Definitely a humbling experience to sit with 3 individuals who are so steeped in the work and so thoughtful, and who have contributed so much to this space. And so thank you, Oscar, thank you, Catherine, and thank you, Elizabeth. It's been a pleasure. Hoping you all stay safe and that you each can enjoy your evening tonight. I hope that is the case for each of you. So for those of you out in Facebook world and joining us elsewhere, that concludes our program for tonight. It's been wonderful to have you along this journey with us. Man, and what a journey we have come along on together. We've got some really, really exciting programs coming up. As you know, Urban Consulate is a national network of salon-style conversations, ranging from topics of racial equity to, as we did today, elections and their impacts on the city, neighborhood, and the nation. And they take place on the second Monday of every month. And our colleagues in Detroit and Chicagoland also host monthly conversations, and I'm excited to talk to you about a little bit of those today. Please join our email list. You can go to urbanconsulate.com and sign up. You can subscribe, and you will get up-to-the-minute updates on all of our programming, and you can register and you won't miss anything. You can also follow Urban Consulate on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter for all of our future programs. About our upcoming events, number one, I want to talk to you about this Wednesday at 7 p.m. Join Courageous Conversations with Dr. Rev Zina Jacques and Eric Liu of Citizen University and Aspen Institute. This will include breakout dialogue to explore a very interesting topic: how we can reimagine our social contract and repair our civic trust. On November 18th, I'm excited to welcome you to another installment of our Practicing Racial Equity series. This is hosted by our fellow Detroit Urban Consulate co-host, Orlando Bailey in Detroit, with 2 rising reporters from the Associated Press and Huffington Post. We're so excited about these upcoming events and hope you'll join us. Once again, stay safe out there, be good to yourselves, and have a good night.